The winter wind howled through the bustling streets of New York City, biting at the faces of hurried commuters wrapped in heavy coats and scarves. Amid the sea of rushing bodies, the chaotic symphony of honking taxis, and the rhythmic clack of hurried footsteps, a disheveled homeless woman stood on the corner of Fifth Avenue. Her coat was tattered, barely shielding her from the cold, and her hands, red and cracked from the winter chill, clutched a crumpled piece of paper as if it were a lifeline. Her piercing blue eyes darted among the crowd, scanning faces with a desperate determination. Then, as if by some invisible force, she stopped. Her eyes locked onto a man stepping out of a sleek black car. His tailored suit, impeccable haircut, and commanding presence made him stand out even in the bustling chaos of the city. William Carrington. The name alone carried weight. CEO of a multi-billion-dollar tech company, William was a man who had climbed to the very top of the corporate ladder, leaving many in his wake. To the outside world, he was the epitome of success. But as the woman stared at him, a faint smile tugged at her lips, as if she knew something the rest of the world didn't. "Excuse me, sir," she called out, her voice trembling but resolute. The sound cut through the city noise, reaching William as he adjusted the gold cufflinks on his sleeves. He paused, his expression one of mild irritation, already dismissing her as just another panhandler. But there was something in her tone, a note of urgency, of familiarity, that made him turn toward her. "What is it?" he asked curtly, his sharp gaze landing on her. His tone was polished but cold, the voice of a man used to shutting down distractions. "This is for you," she said, stepping forward and thrusting the crumpled note into his hand. Her fingers, raw and trembling, brushed against his for a moment. William frowned, glancing at the note. His first instinct was to discard it, to crumple it further and toss it into the nearest trash can. But something stopped him. Her eyes, those piercing blue eyes, held his gaze for a second longer than he was comfortable with. He sighed, unfolding the paper with the intention of humoring her briefly before walking away. But the moment his eyes fell on the words, his breath caught in his throat. Scrawled in shaky handwriting were 4 words that hit him like a punch to the gut. "I know about Emily." The air seemed to thicken around him. His grip on the paper tightened as his mind raced. Emily. The name stirred something deep within him, something he had spent years burying beneath layers of ambition and denial. He looked up sharply, but the woman was already walking away, blending into the crowd like a ghost. "Wait," he called after her, his voice uncharacteristically loud, drawing a few curious glances from passers-by. But she didn't stop. Within seconds, she was gone, leaving only the note and a maelstrom of questions swirling in William's mind. For a moment, he stood frozen on the sidewalk, his usually composed demeanor shattered. Emily. The name echoed in his mind like a haunting melody, dredging up memories he had worked so hard to suppress. Who was this woman? And how did she know? And why now? Shaking himself, William stuffed the note into the pocket of his overcoat and hurried into the towering glass building where his office occupied the top floor. The polished marble lobby, with its sleek modern design and bustling employees, was a stark contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded outside. His assistant, Rachel, was waiting by the elevator, tablet in hand. "Good morning, Mr. Carrington," she said with her usual efficiency. "Your 10 a.m. meeting is ready in conference room 3. Also, Mr. Larson called to confirm lunch at—" "Cancel it," William cut her off, his voice sharper than intended. Rachel blinked, startled, but nodded quickly. "Yes, sir," she said, her tone neutral. William stepped into the elevator without another word, the doors closing behind him with a soft chime. As the elevator ascended, he pulled out the note again, his eyes scanning the words over and over, as if they might rearrange themselves into something less terrifying. By the time he reached his corner office, his mind was a whirlwind of memories. Emily, a name he hadn't spoken or thought about in years. The name of a woman who had once meant everything to him, and whose existence he had buried under the weight of his ambition. He sat down heavily in his chair, the sprawling view of the city skyline ignored as he unfolded the note once more. I know about Emily. The words were simple, but their implications were vast. Who was this woman? What did she know? And why had she chosen now to confront him? His chest tightened as memories he had locked away began to surface. Emily's laughter, her smile, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her dreams. And then, the moment everything had fallen apart, the choices he had made that had led to their estrangement. Unable to focus, William reached for his phone and hesitated. He knew who he needed to call, but the thought of dredging up the past filled him with a sense of dread. Finally, with trembling hands, he dialed the number. It rang twice before a cautious voice answered. "Hello?" "Lisa," William said, his voice faltering. There was a long pause on the other end, followed by a sharp intake of breath. "William, why are you calling me after all these years?" The voice was tinged with suspicion and a hint of anger. "I need to ask about Emily," he said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "Something's happened. A woman approached me today with a note, and it mentioned her name. I don't know what's going on, but—" "Stop," Lisa interrupted, her voice trembling. "You don't get to say her name like that. Not after what you did." William's chest tightened. "Lisa, please. I'm just trying to understand." "Understand," she snapped. "You left her, William. You abandoned her when she needed you the most. And now you want to understand. Spare me." Her words hit him like a slap. He opened his mouth to respond, but the line went dead. For a moment, he stared at the phone in his hand, the weight of her accusations settling over him like a heavy cloak. Emily was gone. The woman he had once loved, the person he had betrayed, was no longer alive. And yet, her presence was suddenly everywhere, inescapable and demanding answers. As he sat there, paralyzed by the storm of emotions, his hand brushed against something else in his pocket. Another piece of paper. He pulled it out, his breath catching when he saw what it was, a photograph. It was Emily holding a baby. Scribbled on the back were 3 more words: "Find the truth." William stared at the photograph, his mind reeling. Who was the child? Was it his? And who had sent these messages? His heart pounded as a sense of urgency overtook him. He didn't have a choice now. He had to uncover the truth, no matter how much it hurt. The past he had buried was clawing its way back, and William knew that his carefully constructed life was about to unravel. The sharp winter chill seemed to linger with William even as he sat in the warmth of his sleek office. The photograph of Emily holding the child lay on his desk, its edges slightly worn, as if it had been handled countless times. His mind was racing, but he couldn't shake the image of her eyes, the quiet joy on her face, the protective way she held the child. The note's words echoed in his head. Find the truth. But what truth? And why now? William reached for his phone with trembling hands. He had always prided himself on decisiveness, yet now, even dialing a number felt like an act of courage. Finally, he dialed someone he hadn't spoken to in years. William Carrington. Came the voice on the other end, gruff and tinged with suspicion. To what do I owe the pleasure? Daniel, William said, steadying his voice. I need your help. Daniel Whitaker was a private investigator who had worked with William during his rise in the corporate world. Back then, Daniel had handled dirty secrets and loose ends with a ruthless efficiency. William had sworn never to call on him again, but today was different. What kind of help? Daniel asked, the sound of a lighter flicking in the background. Trouble at the top. No, William replied curtly. This is personal. I need information about a woman, Emily Dawson. She died 8 years ago, but someone's sending me messages about her. And there's a child. Daniel's silence on the other end stretched uncomfortably long. Finally, he said, You think the kid's yours? I don't know, William admitted, the weight of his words sinking in. That's what I need you to find out. All right, Daniel said, his tone shifting to business. Send me what you've got, photos, notes, anything you can think of. I'll dig around and see what I can uncover. William ended the call and leaned back in his chair, staring out at the city skyline. The power and prestige he had spent his life building suddenly felt meaningless. The world outside continued as it always had, oblivious to the turmoil unraveling inside him. Hours later, his phone buzzed. Daniel's name flashed on the screen. William answered immediately. I've got some breadcrumbs for you, Daniel began. Emily lived in a small town upstate during her final years. Quiet place, nothing fancy. But here's where it gets interesting. There were large sums of money being deposited into her account before she died. Irregular payments coming from shell companies. Someone didn't want to be traced. William's stomach churned. Hush money. Looks like it, Daniel confirmed. And it doesn't end there. A few months before she passed, there was a legal dispute over custody. Someone tried to take the kid away. Records are sealed, but I'll keep digging. William's grip tightened on the phone. Find out who's behind the payments and the custody case. I want names. Will do, Daniel said. But you might not like what you find. After the call, William couldn't sit still. He instructed his driver to take him to the address Daniel had found, Emily's last known residence. The city's chaos faded into quiet suburban streets as they drove, the unfamiliar scenery adding to his growing sense of unease. The house was modest, with peeling paint and a garden overrun with weeds. It was a far cry from the luxury William had grown accustomed to. He hesitated before stepping out of the car, his breath visible in the cold air. A part of him wanted to turn back, to leave the ghosts of his past buried. But the photograph in his pocket reminded him that some truths couldn't be ignored. An elderly woman answered the door, her sharp eyes studying him with a mix of curiosity and caution. Can I help you? She asked, her voice firm but not unkind. My name is William Carrington, he began. I'm looking for information about Emily Dawson. She lived here. The woman's expression softened at the mention of Emily's name. I was her neighbor, she said. Emily was a sweet woman. Hard life, though. Gone too soon. Did she ever talk about me? William asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman hesitated before answering. She mentioned you a few times. Said you were important to her, once. But she didn't dwell on the past. She was focused on her boy. Her words struck him like a hammer. The boy, he said, his throat tightening. Do you know where he is? The woman's gaze narrowed. Why are you asking? What's your connection to him? William reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the photograph. I think he might be my son, he said, his voice raw with emotion. The woman's eyes widened, and for a moment, she seemed at a loss for words. Finally, she stepped aside. You'd better come in. The interior of the house was cluttered but cozy, filled with the smell of tea and the faint hum of an old radio. The woman led William to the kitchen table, where she placed a small, weathered box in front of him. Emily gave this to me before she passed, she explained. She told me to keep it safe and to give it to someone who came looking for the boy. If I believed they had the right to know. William's hands trembled as he opened the box. Inside were photographs, letters, and a small journal. The letters were addressed to my little angel, each one overflowing with love and hope for the future. But it was the journal that captured his attention. As he flipped through the pages, he read Emily's innermost thoughts, her struggles, her fears, and her desperate attempts to protect her son. One entry stopped him cold. If something happens to me, it won't be an accident. Someone doesn't want the truth to come out, but I have to protect him, no matter what. William looked up at the woman, his face pale. Who was she afraid of? The woman shook her head. She never said, but she was always looking over her shoulder, especially after those payments started. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they painted was more terrifying than William had imagined. Someone powerful had been pulling the strings, and now it was up to him to unravel the web of lies. "Do you know where the boy is now?" William asked, his voice urgent. The woman hesitated, then nodded. "He's staying with someone who can keep him safe. But if you're serious about helping him, you'd better be careful. Whoever's behind this won't stop until they get what they want." William stood, the journal clutched tightly in his hand. "I won't let anything happen to him," he said firmly. "I'll find out who's responsible, and I'll make sure they can't hurt him." As he left the house, the weight of Emily's words lingered in his mind. Someone doesn't want the truth to come out. For the first time in years, William felt a sense of purpose. This wasn't just about finding the truth. It was about protecting the son he never knew he had. The drive back to the city felt endless, the hum of the engine a distant background to the storm in William's mind. The journal lay open on his lap, the looping handwriting of Emily staring back at him. Her words were raw, filled with a mixture of hope and fear. She had been afraid, not just for herself, but for their son, a son William had never known existed. The reality hit him in waves, each more crushing than the last. Arriving at his penthouse, William wasted no time. The questions in Emily's journal pointed to someone powerful, someone who had manipulated and controlled her life. He needed answers, and there was only one person who could give him a clearer picture. Picking up his phone, he called Daniel. "I hope you have something for me," William said, pacing the length of his living room. "I've got leads," Daniel replied. The money deposited into Emily's account came from a company called Alton Holdings. Shell company, no obvious connections, but guess who's listed as a director? Who? William demanded, his grip tightening on the phone. "Ever heard of Gerald Kingsley?" Daniel asked. "Real estate mogul. Big name in the business world about a decade ago, but he's been keeping a low profile recently. Turns out, Kingsley had some legal troubles. Nothing public, of course. Rumors of blackmail, payoffs. Your kind of guy." William's chest tightened. He knew Kingsley. They had crossed paths years ago during a business deal that had gone south. Kingsley had been ruthless, a man who thrived on leverage and manipulation. But why would Kingsley target Emily? "I need everything on Kingsley," William said, "and find out if he's still in New York." "On it," Daniel replied. "But if you're planning to confront him, be careful. Kingsley doesn't play fair." The next morning, William sat in his office, staring at his computer screen. His assistant Rachel knocked lightly before entering. "Mr. Carrington, you have a meeting in 20 minutes, she reminded him. "Cancel it," William said without looking up. "And hold all my calls." Rachel hesitated but nodded. "Of course, sir." Once alone, William typed Gerald Kingsley's name into a search engine. Articles and photos filled the screen, showing the older man's sharp features and piercing gaze. Kingsley had once been a prominent figure, but his name had faded from the headlines in recent years. William's jaw clenched as he scrolled through an article detailing Kingsley's involvement in shady business dealings, most of which had been swept under the rug. The more William read, the more convinced he became that Kingsley was the man Emily had feared. But why? What connection did Kingsley have to her? And why had he tried to take their son? Later that afternoon, Daniel called back. "Got an address for you," he said. "Kingsley's staying at a private estate just outside the city. Tight security, but nothing you can't handle." William didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat and left the office, instructing his driver to head to the estate. The ride was tense, every passing mile amplifying his determination. He had spent years running from the past, but now he was running toward it. The estate was sprawling, surrounded by tall gates and dense trees. William's car was stopped at the entrance by a security guard who looked him over suspiciously. "I'm here to see Gerald Kingsley," William said firmly. "Do you have an appointment?" the guard asked. "Tell him it's William Carrington," he replied. "He'll want to see me." The guard made a call, his expression neutral as he spoke into a headset. After a moment, he nodded and stepped aside, allowing the car through. As the car approached the main house, William felt a knot form in his stomach. The house was an architectural masterpiece, all sharp angles and glass, perched on a hill with a view of the city in the distance. Kingsley was waiting at the entrance, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp. "William Carrington," Kingsley said, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "It's been a while." "Not long enough," William replied, stepping out of the car. "We need to talk." Kingsley motioned for him to follow, leading him into the house. The interior was as extravagant as the exterior, filled with modern art and expensive furniture. They entered a study lined with bookshelves and dominated by a massive desk. "Let me guess," Kingsley said, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. "You're here about Emily." William's jaw tightened. "You knew her?" "Of course I knew her," Kingsley said, taking a sip. "She was important for a time." William's hands balled into fists. "What did you do to her? Why was she afraid of you?" Kingsley chuckled, setting his glass down. "Afraid? No. You've got it all wrong. Emily and I had an arrangement. She needed help, and I provided it. For a price." "What price?" William demanded. Kingsley's smirk faded. "Let's just say she owed me something she couldn't pay back. And when she ran out of options, she turned to you." William took a step forward, his voice low and dangerous. "And the child, what were you trying to do to him?" The boy," Kingsley said, his tone almost amused. "Let's just say he's valuable. Too valuable to leave in the hands of someone like her." Rage bubbled up inside William. "You tried to take him away. You made her life hell." Kingsley raised an eyebrow. "Careful, Carrington. You're out of your depth here." Before William could respond, a door opened, and a man in a suit stepped in, whispering something to Kingsley. The older man's expression darkened, and he turned back to William. "Consider this a warning," Kingsley said. "Whatever you think you're doing, stop. For your own good." But William wasn't intimidated. He turned and left, his resolve stronger than ever. Kingsley might have been powerful, but William had something more valuable: Emily's words and the truth she had left behind. And he wasn't going to stop until he uncovered every last secret. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows over the city as William returned to his penthouse. His confrontation with Kingsley replayed in his mind, each word seared into his thoughts. There was no mistaking it now. Kingsley was at the center of whatever darkness had enveloped Emily's life. But his cryptic warning only fueled William's determination. If Kingsley thought intimidation would work, he had underestimated the man William had become. He dropped his coat onto a chair and sat at his desk, staring at Emily's journal. Every page was a doorway into her struggles, her fears, and her unwavering love for their son. William flipped to the entries dated around the time she had started receiving the mysterious payments. Her handwriting became more erratic, her thoughts disjointed. "They won't stop calling. I don't know how they found me, but I can't let them take him. He's all I have. The money helps, but it feels like a trap. Every time I use it, I feel their grip tighten. I have to find another way. If I don't survive this, I need someone to know the truth. I need someone to protect him." The anguish in her words hit William like a punch to the gut. She had been fighting a battle he hadn't even known existed, all while protecting a child he had been oblivious to. He felt a mix of guilt and anger. Anger at Kingsley, at himself, at the world that had failed Emily. But now wasn't the time to dwell on regret. He needed answers, and he knew exactly where to start. The next day, William met Daniel at a small diner on the outskirts of the city. The investigator looked tired, his usual sharp demeanor slightly dulled by the weight of what he had uncovered. "You're not going to like this," Daniel said, sliding a folder across the table. William opened it, his eyes scanning the contents. Inside were financial records, court documents, and surveillance photos. Each piece of evidence painted a chilling picture. The payments Emily received came directly from Kingsley's network, Daniel explained. But they weren't just hush money. They were bait, designed to keep her dependent on him. He wanted leverage. William's eyes narrowed. Leverage for what? Daniel hesitated before answering. The boy. Kingsley had no legal claim, but he filed for custody anyway. Claimed Emily was an unfit mother, that she couldn't provide a stable environment. He almost won. Almost. William asked, his voice cold. She fought back. Daniel said, a note of admiration in his tone. She used every resource she had, including some of the money he sent her, to hire a lawyer and keep the boy. But it wasn't easy. The stress took a toll. William's grip on the folder tightened. And after she died, Daniel sighed. Kingsley tried again, but someone stepped in. Victor Matthews. William frowned. Who's Victor Matthews? Former lawyer turned advocate for people like Emily, Daniel explained. He runs a network that protects families from predators like Kingsley. He's the one who took the boy in after Emily's death. Where is he now? William demanded. Daniel scribbled an address on a napkin and slid it across the table. He's cautious, so don't expect him to roll out the welcome mat. But if anyone has the answers you're looking for, it's him. Later that evening, William stood outside a modest house in a quiet neighborhood. The lights were on inside, and he could hear faint laughter through the windows. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorbell. For a moment, he considered turning back. What if Victor refused to help? What if he didn't believe William deserved to know the truth? Steeling himself, William pressed the doorbell. The sound echoed inside, and a few moments later, the door opened. A tall man with graying hair and a weathered face stood before him, his eyes narrowing as he took in William's appearance. "You're Carrington," Victor said, his tone flat. It wasn't a question. "I am," William replied. "I need to talk to you about Emily and the boy." Victor's jaw tightened, but he stepped aside, gesturing for William to enter. The house was simple but warm, filled with bookshelves and photographs. In one corner, a boy sat at a table, engrossed in a sketchbook. William's breath caught. The boy had Emily's eyes. Victor noticed his gaze and stepped in front of him, blocking the view. "If you're here to make a claim, you're wasting your time." "I'm not here to take him," William said quickly. "I didn't even know he existed until a few days ago. I need to understand what happened, and I want to help." Victor studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Follow me." He led William to a small office at the back of the house. The walls were lined with legal documents and case files, evidence of Victor's work. He gestured for William to sit, then closed the door. "Emily trusted me to protect her son," Victor began, his voice steady but firm. "She didn't talk much about you, but when she did, it was clear you had hurt her deeply. She wanted nothing from you, not even your name on his birth certificate." William flinched at the words, but didn't interrupt. "But when Kingsley came after her, she realized she couldn't fight him alone. That's when she came to me," Victor continued. "I helped her navigate the legal system, and we managed to keep the boy safe. But it was a close call. Why was Kingsley so fixated on him?" William asked. Victor's expression darkened. "Kingsley isn't just a businessman. He's part of a network that traffics influence and power. The boy represents something he wants: leverage over you. Kingsley knows your name carries weight, and having control over your son would give him a way to manipulate you." The revelation sent a chill through William. "Does the boy know?" he asked softly. "No," Victor said firmly, "and he doesn't need to. As far as he's concerned, he's just a normal kid. My job is to keep it that way." William leaned forward, his voice resolute. "I want to help. I don't care what it costs or how long it takes. I need to make this right for Emily and for him." Victor studied him for a long moment before nodding. If you're serious, there's one thing you need to understand. This isn't just about protecting the boy. It's about taking down Kingsley and everything he represents. Are you ready for that? I am, William said without hesitation. Victor nodded again, his expression softening slightly. Then we start tomorrow. The following morning, William arrived at Victor's home with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. His mind was still reeling from the revelations of the previous night. Kingsley's twisted motivations, Emily's desperate fight to protect their son, and the boy's existence itself. But for the first time, he wasn't focused on his guilt. He was focused on what he could do to make things right. Victor greeted him at the door with his usual guarded demeanor. "Come in," he said briskly, stepping aside to let William enter. The house was quiet, save for the faint sound of a television in the living room. William's eyes drifted toward the source of the noise, and there he was, Ethan. The boy sat cross-legged on the couch, his curly dark hair catching the morning light as he watched an animated superhero show. His small frame seemed impossibly fragile, yet there was something in the way he held himself that reminded William of Emily. Strong, determined, resilient. Ethan turned briefly at the sound of footsteps, but quickly shifted his attention back to the TV. Victor gave William a warning glance, silently reminding him to tread carefully. "Follow me," Victor said, leading William into the kitchen. On the table sat a stack of documents and a steaming pot of coffee. "If we're going to protect Ethan, we need to be strategic," Victor began, pouring a cup. "Kingsley isn't going to stop. He's like a dog with a bone, and now that you're involved, he has more reason than ever to escalate." "What's the plan?" William asked, his voice steady. He'd spent his life making decisions under pressure, and he was determined to channel that skill into helping his son. Victor slid a manila folder across the table. Inside were surveillance photos of Kingsley's estate, legal documents, and what appeared to be a series of coded transactions. "These are the threads we need to pull," Victor said. "Kingsley's power lies in his ability to stay hidden. If we can expose his network, show the world what he's really been doing, he'll lose his leverage." William studied the documents, his mind already working through the logistics. "How do we gather the evidence without putting Ethan at risk?" "That's where I come in," Victor said. "I have connections, people who owe me favors, but it's going to take time. And while we're working on this, you need to focus on building trust with Ethan. If this comes to a head, he needs to know who's fighting for him." William's gaze flicked toward the living room. The thought of connecting with Ethan both thrilled and terrified him. "He doesn't even know who I am," he said quietly. "Not yet," Victor replied. "But you don't have to tell him everything right away. Start small. Let him get to know you." Later that afternoon, William found himself standing in the doorway of the living room, watching Ethan as he sketched in a notebook. The boy's small hands moved deftly across the page, bringing a scene to life. A superhero standing tall against a backdrop of swirling chaos. William hesitated, then cleared his throat. "That's impressive," he said, stepping into the room. Ethan looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly. "It's just a drawing," he said, his tone cautious. "No, really," William said, sitting down on the edge of the couch. "I couldn't draw like that when I was your age. Is that your own superhero?" Ethan nodded slowly, his name Shadowblade. "He can disappear and reappear anywhere. He uses shadows to fight bad guys." William smiled. "Sounds like a hero who doesn't give up." Ethan shrugged, glancing back at his sketch. "Heroes don't always win." The words hit William harder than he expected. He leaned forward, his tone softening. "Maybe not always," he said, "but the best heroes keep trying, no matter how hard it gets." Ethan didn't respond, but he didn't turn away either. For William, that felt like progress. Over the next few days, William made a point of spending more time with Ethan. They played board games, watched movies, and even went for a walk in the nearby park. Each interaction was tentative, a careful dance as they navigated the fragile beginnings of a relationship. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Ethan broke the silence. "Victor says you're here to help," he said, his voice quiet. "Why do you care?" The question caught William off guard. He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Because I care about you," he said honestly. "And because I didn't know about you until recently. If I had, things might have been different." Ethan studied him, his young face unreadable. "Victor says you're a good guy," he said finally. "But you don't look like a hero." William chuckled softly. "Sometimes heroes don't look like what we expect," he said. "But that doesn't mean they're not trying to do the right thing." Ethan didn't reply, but he seemed to relax slightly, leaning back against the porch railing. For William, it was enough. Meanwhile, Victor's investigation began to yield results. Late one night, he called William into his study, where a series of documents and photographs were spread across the desk. "We've found a crack in Kingsley's armor," Victor said. "One of his associates is willing to talk, under the right conditions." "Who?" William asked, leaning over the desk. "A man named Carter Hayes," Victor replied. "He handled some of Kingsley's financial dealings. He's scared, but if we can protect him, he might give us what we need to bring Kingsley down." William's jaw tightened. "What does he want?" "Assurances that Kingsley won't come after him," Victor said. "That's easier said than done. We'll figure out," William said firmly. "Whatever it takes." Victor nodded, his expression serious. "This is just the beginning, William. Once we start pulling these threads, there's no going back." "I'm ready," William said without hesitation. "Kingsley won't get away with this." "Not anymore." Victor's gaze softened slightly. "You've changed," he said. "Emily would have been proud." The words caught William off guard, a lump forming in his throat. "I hope so," he said quietly. "I just want to make things right, for her and for Ethan." As the night wore on, William and Victor strategized, mapping out their next moves. The path ahead was fraught with danger, but William didn't care. For the first time in years, he felt like he was fighting for something that truly mattered. The morning dawned gray and heavy, with rain streaking the windows of Victor's home. William stood in the kitchen, staring out at the dreary weather as he sipped his coffee. The weight of the last few days pressed on him, but he couldn't afford to falter. Kingsley's reach was vast, and the clock was ticking. Every moment spent waiting felt like another opportunity for the man to tighten his grip. Victor entered the kitchen, a folder in hand. "We've got a meeting set with Carter Hayes," he said. It wasn't easy to convince him, but he's agreed to talk. "When and where?" William asked, setting his mug down. "This afternoon, at a diner on the outskirts of the city," Victor replied. "He doesn't trust anyone, so he's keeping it low-key. But make no mistake, he's terrified of Kingsley. If he senses any risk, he'll bolt." William nodded. "I'll make sure he feels safe. He's our best chance to get something solid on Kingsley." Victor studied him for a moment, then placed a hand on his shoulder. "Be careful. Kingsley isn't the type to leave loose ends. If Hayes knows something valuable, Kingsley will have eyes on him, and anyone he talks to." The diner was a nondescript building with a faded sign and a half-empty parking lot. William arrived early, scanning the room as he entered. The smell of fried food and stale coffee filled the air, and a handful of patrons sat scattered across the booths. He chose a table in the corner, where he could see both the entrance and the rest of the diner. A few minutes later, Carter Hayes walked in. He was a wiry man in his late 40s, with nervous energy radiating off him. His eyes darted around the room before landing on William. With a hesitant nod, he approached the table. "You Carrington?" Hayes asked, his voice low. "I am," William replied, gesturing for him to sit. "Thanks for agreeing to meet." Hayes slid into the booth, his hands fidgeting with a napkin. "I don't know why I'm doing this," he muttered. "If Kingsley finds out." "He won't," William assured him. "Victor and I will make sure of that. But we need your help. You worked for Kingsley. You know how he operates." Hayes hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the window. "I handled his accounts," he said finally. "Money laundering, offshore investments, shell companies. The guy's built an empire on dirty money. But it's not just the money, it's what he does with it." "What do you mean?" William pressed. Hayes leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "Kingsley doesn't just buy properties or fund businesses. He buys people. Politicians, judges, law enforcement, you name it. And once he owns you, you're his for life." Emily, she got caught up in that. William's stomach churned. "How?" Hayes sighed. "Kingsley had something on her. I don't know what. He kept it close to the chest. But whatever it was, it scared her. He used it to control her, to make her dependent on him. She tried to break free. But what?" William demanded. Hayes looked away, guilt etched on his face. He tightened the leash. He started threatening her, using the boy as leverage. That's why she came to Victor. She was desperate. William's fists clenched under the table. "And the money he sent her's part of his game," Hayes said. He wanted her to feel trapped, to think she couldn't survive without him. But when she started fighting back, things got messy. "Messy how?" William asked, his voice tight. Hayes hesitated, then pulled a USB drive from his pocket and slid it across the table. "This has everything I've got: records, transactions, names. It's enough to start pulling threads. But you didn't hear it from me." William picked up the drive, his mind racing. "Why are you doing this? Why now?" Hayes shrugged, a bitter smile on his lips. "Because I'm tired of living in fear. And because Emily didn't deserve what happened to her. Neither does the boy." As William left the diner, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. His eyes scanned the parking lot, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, he couldn't afford to take chances. He drove straight back to Victor's house, where the older man was waiting. "Hayes came through," William said, holding up the USB drive. "This could be the break we need." Victor took the drive, his expression serious. "I'll get my tech guy to decrypt it, but we need to move fast. If Kingsley gets wind of this—" "I know," William interrupted. "We're running out of time." That evening, Victor's tech contact decrypted the files. The room was silent as William and Victor pored over the data. It was worse than they had imagined. The records detailed Kingsley's extensive network of corruption, with names and transactions linking him to high-profile figures across the city. But was one file in particular that caught William's attention: a series of payments labeled Project Anchor. "What's Project Anchor?" William asked, his eyes narrowing. Victor's face darkened. "I've heard rumors. It's Kingsley's contingency plan, a way to ensure his power even if someone tries to take him down. If this is what I think it is, it's not just about money. It's about control." The file included plans for leveraging Ethan as a bargaining chip. Kingsley had been preparing for years, laying the groundwork to use the boy against William. The realization sent a surge of anger through him. "This ends now," William said, his voice firm. "We have everything we need to expose him." Victor nodded, but his expression remained cautious. "It's not just about exposing him. We have to make sure Ethan stays safe. If Kingsley feels cornered, he'll lash out. We'll protect him," William said. "No matter what." The following day, William sat down with Ethan in the living room. The boy looked up from his sketchpad, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "I wanted to talk to you," William began, his voice steady but gentle. "About your mom." Ethan's expression shifted, a mixture of sadness and curiosity. "You knew her?" "I did," William said. "She was one of the strongest, kindest people I've ever met. And she loved you more than anything in the world." Ethan set down his sketchpad, his small hands resting in his lap. "Victor says you're here to help. Is that true?" "Yes," William replied. "I'm here to make sure you're safe, and to make sure the people who hurt your mom can't hurt anyone else." Ethan studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay." It was a small word, but it carried immense weight. For the first time, William felt a glimmer of hope. They were making progress, not just in the fight against Kingsley, but in building a bond that could withstand the trials ahead. As the evening wore on, William and Ethan sat together, talking about superheroes and dreams. For a brief moment, the weight of the world lifted, and William allowed himself to imagine a future where they could both be free of the shadows that had haunted them. But deep down, he knew the battle was far from over. The storm that had threatened all day finally broke as night fell, rain hammering against the windows of Victor's home. Inside, William and Victor sat in the study, their faces illuminated by the glow of a computer screen. The decrypted files from Carter Hayes were spread out before them, each document a damning piece of evidence against Kingsley's sprawling empire of corruption. "This is it," Victor said, his voice low but resolute. "We've got everything we need to take him down. The money laundering, the bribes, the offshore accounts. It's all here." William leaned forward, his jaw tight. "But it's not just about taking Kingsley down. It's about protecting Ethan. If Kingsley knows we're closing in, he won't hesitate to retaliate." Victor nodded, his expression grim. "That's why we need to move carefully. We can't tip our hand until we're ready to deliver a knockout blow." The next morning, William met with Daniel at a secure location, a small office in an unmarked building downtown. Daniel had been working behind the scenes to build a case that could withstand the inevitable backlash from Kingsley's powerful allies. "I've already reached out to a few journalists," Daniel said as he spread a series of documents across the table. "Trusted ones. If we can corroborate everything in these files, we'll have a story big enough to force the authorities to act." "But Kingsley has people in his pocket," William said, frowning. "Even if we expose him, what's to stop him from slipping away?" "That's why we need a backup plan," Daniel replied. "Something that forces his hand. If we can cut off his resources, freeze his accounts, dismantle his network, he'll lose his leverage. But it has to be coordinated." William nodded. "Then let's make it happen." That evening, as the rain continued to pour, Victor gathered William and Ethan in the living room. The boy had been quiet all day, sensing the tension in the air. "Ethan," Victor began, his tone gentle but firm, "there's something important we need to talk about." Ethan looked up, his expression wary. "What is it?" Victor glanced at William, who took a deep breath before speaking. "You know how we've been talking about keeping you safe?" he asked. "Well, there are people, bad people, who might try to hurt you because of me." Ethan's eyes widened. "Because of you?" William nodded, his heart aching at the fear in the boy's voice. "Yes, but I won't let anything happen to you. Neither will Victor. We're going to make sure you're safe, no matter what." Ethan hesitated, then asked, "What about the bad people? Can't you stop them?" "That's what we're working on," William said. "But we need your help. We need you to trust us." The boy studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Okay, I trust you." The plan came together over the next 48 hours. William and Victor worked with Daniel to coordinate the release of the files to multiple media outlets, ensuring that Kingsley wouldn't be able to contain the fallout. Meanwhile, Victor's network began freezing Kingsley's accounts and cutting off his access to key resources. But Kingsley wasn't the type to go down without a fight. On the eve of the plan's execution, Victor received a message from one of his contacts. Kingsley had sent people to track Ethan. "They're getting desperate," Victor said, his voice tight with anger. "They know we're closing in." William's blood ran cold. "What do we do?" "We move Ethan," Victor replied. "Tonight. I've got a safe house ready, but we need to be careful. If they're watching, we can't let them see where we're going." The night was pitch black as William and Victor loaded Ethan into an unmarked car. The boy clutched his sketchbook, his small hands trembling despite his efforts to appear brave. "It's going to be okay," William said, his voice steady. "We're going to keep you safe." Ethan nodded, but the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. William's heart ached as he realized just how much the boy had already endured. Victor drove, taking a circuitous route to throw off any potential followers. The rain slicked the streets, the headlights cutting through the darkness as they made their way toward the safe house. William kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting a car to appear in pursuit. Finally, they arrived at a secluded cabin nestled in the woods. It was small but secure, with reinforced doors and a state-of-the-art security system. Victor ushered Ethan inside, showing him to a small bedroom where he could rest. "You'll be safe here," Victor said. "We've got everything you need." Ethan hesitated at the doorway, then turned to William. "Will you stay with me?" William knelt down, his eyes level with Ethan's. "I'm not going anywhere," he promised. As Ethan settled into the room, William joined Victor in the living area. The tension between them was palpable. "What now?" William asked, his voice low. "Now we wait," Victor replied. "Once the files go public, Kingsley will be too busy dealing with the fallout to come after Ethan. But until then, we stay vigilant." William nodded, but the weight of the situation pressed heavily on him. He had spent his life building walls, keeping people at arm's length. But now, with Ethan, those walls had crumbled. He wasn't just fighting to take down Kingsley, he was fighting for the chance to be a father. The night passed slowly, every creak of the cabin making William's heart race. He sat by the window, watching the rain as it tapered off into a light drizzle. Sleep was impossible. His mind was too full of plans, fears, and regrets. In the early hours of the morning, his phone buzzed. It was Daniel. "It's done," Daniel said. "The files are out. Every major outlet is running the story. Kingsley's scrambling, but the authorities are already moving in." William exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "And Ethan's?" "No sign of trouble," Daniel assured him. "But stay on high alert. Kingsley's dangerous when he's cornered." "Thanks, Daniel," William said, ending the call. He turned to Victor, who had been listening. "It started." Victor nodded, his expression grim but determined. "Now we see how far Kingsley's willing to go." As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, William checked on Ethan, who was still fast asleep. The boy's peaceful expression was a stark contrast to the chaos surrounding them. For the first time in days, William allowed himself a sliver of hope. The battle was far from over, but they had taken a crucial step. Kingsley's empire was crumbling, and the truth that Emily had fought so hard to protect was finally coming to light. William stood by the window, watching as the sun rose over the trees. The fight wasn't finished, but he knew one thing for certain. He would do whatever it took to protect Ethan and honor Emily's memory. The morning light poured through the cabin windows, its warmth a stark contrast to the cold resolve in William's chest. News outlets across the country had picked up the story, exposing Kingsley's empire of corruption in damning detail. The fallout was immediate, authorities raiding properties, allies abandoning ship, and Kingsley himself going silent. But silence from a man like Kingsley was never a good sign. Victor entered the room, his phone pressed to his ear. He ended the call with a grim expression. "Kingsley's network is collapsing, but he's not going quietly. There's chatter about him making one last move." William's jaw tightened. "What kind of move?" "Desperate," Victor replied. "He knows he's finished if he doesn't act fast, and he's still fixated on Ethan. We need to stay vigilant." William nodded, his mind racing. He glanced toward the small bedroom where Ethan was still sleeping. The boy had no idea how close they were to danger, and that was exactly how William wanted to keep it. By mid-morning, the cabin's security system detected movement on the perimeter. Victor's eyes darted to the monitors, where a grainy image of a car parked down the dirt road appeared. "Who is it?" William asked, stepping closer. "Can't tell," Victor replied, "but we're not taking chances." The two men moved quickly, securing the cabin and preparing for the worst. Victor handed William a small handgun. "Just in case," he said. William took it without hesitation, his grip steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "What about Ethan?" "I've already set up a panic room," Victor said. "If anything happens, we get him inside and lock it down." An hour passed with no further movement. The tension in the cabin was suffocating. Then, a knock echoed through the heavy wooden door. William and Victor exchanged a tense glance. Victor moved to the intercom system, his voice firm. "Who's there?" "Agent Reed, FBI," a voice replied. "We need to talk about Gerald Kingsley." William frowned. "The FBI?" Victor didn't move to open the door. "Identification," he demanded. After a pause, a badge was held up to the camera. Victor studied it carefully, then nodded. He opened the door a crack, keeping his body tense and ready to act. A man in his 40s with a clean-cut appearance stepped inside, his sharp eyes scanning the room. "Mr. Carrington, Mr. Matthews," Agent Reed began, addressing them both. "Kingsley is on the move. We believe he's headed this way." "Why?" William asked, his voice cold. "Because you're the last loose end," Reed replied. "The evidence you've exposed has left him with nothing to lose. He's desperate, and that makes him dangerous." Victor folded his arms. "What's your plan?" "We've got a team en route," Reed said. "Our goal is to intercept him before he reaches this location. But I need you both to be ready. If he gets here before we do, you need to secure the boy and protect yourselves." William's fists clenched. "We're not letting him anywhere near Ethan." Reed nodded. "I'll stay here until my team arrives. In the meantime, keep your defenses up." The afternoon passed in a haze of preparation. Ethan, sensing the tension, stayed close to William. The boy's presence was a reminder of why they were fighting, and William vowed silently that he wouldn't let Kingsley hurt him. As dusk approached, Victor's phone buzzed with a message. His face darkened as he read it. "Kingsley's close." He slipped past one of the roadblocks. Reed swore under his breath. "We don't have much time. Get Ethan into the panic room." William nodded and knelt in front of Ethan. "Hey, buddy," he said softly. "We're going to play a little game, okay? I need you to go with Victor to a special room where you'll be safe." Ethan's eyes widened. "What about you?" "I'll be right here," William promised. "I just need to make sure everything's okay." Ethan hesitated, then nodded. Victor led the boy to the panic room, locking it securely once Ethan was inside. William and Reed positioned themselves near the front of the cabin, their weapons drawn. The air was thick with anticipation. When Kingsley finally arrived, it wasn't subtle. A black SUV barreled down the dirt road, skidding to a halt outside the cabin. 3 men stepped out, their faces hard and their movements purposeful. Kingsley emerged last, his once polished demeanor replaced with a feral desperation. "Carrington," he shouted, his voice echoing through the trees. "Let's talk." William stepped to the window, his expression unreadable. "There's nothing to talk about, Kingsley. It's over." Kingsley laughed, a hollow sound that sent chills down William's spine. "You think this is over? You think a few files and some headlines are enough to stop me? You don't know who you're dealing with." "I know enough," William replied. "And so does the rest of the world." Kingsley's smirk faded, replaced by cold fury. "You're going to regret this." The men with him began moving toward the cabin, their weapons drawn. William's pulse quickened. "They're coming." Reed stepped forward, his gun raised. "Stand down," he shouted, his voice commanding. "You're surrounded." But Kingsley's men didn't falter. A gunshot rang out, shattering the tense silence. Reed returned fire, and chaos erupted. William ducked behind a table, his heart pounding as bullets tore through the cabin's walls. Victor appeared at his side, his own weapon drawn. "We can't let them get to Ethan." "I won't," William said, his voice resolute. The firefight was brief, but intense. Reed's training proved invaluable, and between him, William, and Victor, they managed to hold off Kingsley's men. When the last of them fell, Kingsley stood alone, his face pale but defiant. "You've lost," William said, stepping out from cover. His gun was steady, aimed directly at Kingsley. "It's over." Kingsley sneered. You think this changes anything? You've made enemies you can't even imagine. I'll take my chances, William replied. Sirens filled the air as FBI vehicles arrived, their lights cutting through the darkness. Kingsley's sneer faltered as agents swarmed the area, arresting him and the remaining members of his crew. When the dust settled, William made his way to the panic room. Victor unlocked the door, and Ethan rushed out, throwing his arms around William. Is it over? The boy asked, his voice trembling. William knelt down, holding him tightly. It's over, he said. You're safe now. Ethan buried his face in William's shoulder, and for the first time, William felt the weight of his guilt lift. He had fought for his son, just as Emily would have wanted, and in doing so, he had found a sense of purpose he hadn't known he was missing. As the sun rose the next morning, William stood on the cabin's porch, watching the light filter through the trees. The battle was over, but the journey was just beginning. Ethan's safety was no longer in doubt, but there was still so much to rebuild. Trust, love, and a future free from the shadows of the past. And William was ready to face it all. And now, I want to hear from you. Which part of this story touched your heart the most? Leave a comment and share your thoughts. And of course, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more narratives like this. Each subscription helps us continue bringing exciting stories to you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.